He never came back. From Darter 10. I worked as a Border Patrol agent for several years before taking a desk job instead. It was a tough job. Long hours and often unforgiving conditions. Not to mention, it seems like nobody likes you for what you do. You also saw a lot of things out there in the desert. Things that can shake even the most seasoned agent. But there was one series of events, one particular partner, that I'll never forget. It's a story I don't tell often, but when I do, people tend to look at me a little differently afterwards. The ones that believe me look at the desert a little differently too. About 5 years ago, I was stationed down near the border in one of the most remote stretches of our patrol area. It was the kind of place where the night sky is so clear, you feel like you can reach out and touch the stars. But that kind of clarity also brings a sort of emptiness with it. I just feel like it can play tricks on your mind, make you see and hear things that aren't there. Or maybe they are there, maybe we're just not equipped to understand it. My partner at the time was a guy I'll call Mike. He was a few years younger than me, still relatively new to the job. But Mike was sharp, and he had good instincts. We got along well too, which meant a lot for this job. We passed the long nights with idle chatter and some bad jokes. It was on one of those night patrols that things started to get strange. We were driving along the border fence, scanning the darkness with our spotlight, when Mike suddenly went rigid. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice tense. I turned down the crackly radio. Hear what?" "That whistling. It sounded close, like it was coming from just on the other side of the fence." I listened hard, but all I could hear was the hum of the engine and the wind whistling past our SUV. "I don't hear a thing. Maybe you heard the wind." Mike shook his head. "No, it was different. It sounded, I don't know, human." We sat in silence for a few minutes, straining our ears. But the night remained quiet beyond our vehicle, undisturbed. Finally, Mike sighed and leaned back in his seat. Maybe you're right. Things just feel weird out here sometimes." A few nights later, it happened again. This time we were out on foot, checking a sensor which had been tripped near a known smuggling route. As we hiked through the scrubby brush, I heard it. A clear, melodic whistle. Reminded me of a bird call, but not quite. It was coming from a stand of trees about 50 yards to our left. I glanced at Mike and saw him frozen there, his hand on his sidearm. He met my eyes, and I could see the same unease that I felt reflected back at me. Without a word, we changed course, moving cautiously towards this sound. As we got closer, the whistling stopped. The night was suddenly eerily silent. Even the usual chorus of insects and night birds had gone quiet. We switched on our flashlights, sweeping the beams over the gnarled trunks and spiny undergrowth. We then saw something. Just for a second, at the very edge of the light, a figure, pale and unnaturally thin, darting between the trees. Whatever it was, whoever it was, they were there and gone so fast, I nearly convinced myself I had imagined it. But then I heard Mike's sharp intake of breath. "Did you see that?" His voice was barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. We pressed forward, more urgently now. But no matter how quickly we moved, the figure and its noises seemed to stay just ahead of us, its form flitting in and out of sight, like some sort of ghost. The whole time that eerie whistling wound through the trees, also always seeming to come from just ahead of us. Eventually, we burst into a small clearing and stopped dead. There in the center of the open space was a perfect circle of stones. They had been arranged way too neatly to be natural, each one placed with obvious intention. In the center of that circle, the dirt had been disturbed. like something had been buried there. We looked at one another, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Neither of us were superstitious men, but there was definitely something about that circle, about the whole night even, that felt wrong. To me, it was like we had intruded on something we weren't supposed to see. Without a word, we backed out of the clearing and returned to the SUV. We didn't talk about what we'd seen. Not on the drive back, not in the locker room as we changed out of our uniforms. But I could tell it was weighing on Mike. He was quieter on our patrols after that, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows. A few weeks went by without incident. We started to relax, convincing ourselves it had just been a weird night, a trick of the light and the mind. But then we got a call. A sensor had been tripped out in the desert. It wasn't far from where we'd seen the stone circle. That shift, when the sensors were nearby, we were taking turns going to check it out alone, because most of the sensors there didn't allow travel by SUV, not unless you wanted to risk tearing up the vehicle and getting written up for it. So it was Mike's turn to check it out. He gave me a long look as he climbed out of the SUV, like he wanted to say something, but in the end, he just shook his head and trudged off into the night, his flashlight bobbing in the darkness. I waited for him to come back. 5 minutes, 10, 15. The radio stayed silent. A feeling of anxiety began to grow in my gut. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my gear and set off in the direction Mike had gone. When I couldn't find him, I began to call out his name into the night. I found his flashlight first. It was lying in the dirt, still switched on. A few feet away was his radio, followed by his hat. But no sign of Mike. It was like he had simply vanished into the desert. I ran back and called it in, my voice shaking. Within an hour, the area was swarming with agents, search dogs, helicopters. But as the night wore on and the sun rose, there was still no trace of Mike. It was like the desert swallowed him whole. The official report said that he must have gotten disoriented, that he wandered off, got lost. But I knew Mike. I knew he wasn't the type to just wander off, and I couldn't shake the memory of that pale figure we'd seen in the trees and that perfect circle of stones. It wasn't until a few days later that they found it. Mike's belt, coiled neatly on a rock about a mile from where he disappeared. And sitting on top of it, glinting in the sun, were two small metal objects. I saw the pictures. Took me a moment to recognize them. Tooth fillings. Both of Mike's tooth fillings. I knew for sure then Mike hadn't simply disappeared. He was taken. And a feeling deep inside of me, one that I couldn't talk about, said that Mike had been taken by something not so human. Possibly the same thing responsible for the circle of stones. A normal animal wouldn't just pluck the fillings from a man's teeth and neatly arrange his belt around a rock. This was something else. Something that I can't explain, can't understand. It didn't take me long after that to transfer out of the sector. I took a desk job instead, spent more time with my family. But I've never forgotten that night, and I never did stop wondering what really happened to Mike out there in the desert. It kills me inside, thinking that Mike is now just another ghost story. A real man with real feelings, his own family, now just a legend that agents tell each other about the worst that can happen out there. If you live close to the border, or heck, you work at the border like I used to, be mindful of your eyes and ears, and don't go chasing ghosts in the dark, especially alone. Border Patrol Ghost Story from A Line at a Time. It was another long night shift at the border. I remember sitting in the state-issued SUV with two other officers, I'll call them Jim and Terry. We were parked on a remote stretch of the border, miles from the nearest town, watching and waiting, which is what we do most nights, sitting for hours, scanning the darkness with night vision goggles, looking for any signs of movement. Jim and Terry were good guys, easy to work with. Jim was about my age, mid-30s, with a wife and 2 young kids at home. Terry was an older dude, in his late 50s. He'd been on the job longer than Jim and I combined. We often passed the time on these long nights by swapping stories. It was the typical stuff most of the time. Funny arrests, crazy chases, bureaucratic nonsense. But on that night, Terry was quiet. He seemed lost in thought. He was just staring out into the dark. "You all right there, Terry?" Jim asked, noticing the man's silence. Terry snapped to attention. He looked at me and then to Jim, like he was about to say something. "You boys ever hear any strange stories about this stretch of the border?" he asked, his voice serious. Jim and I exchanged a look. We had heard the usual rumors and urban legends that circulate among Border Patrol agents. Tales of drug runners and human traffickers, and the occasional ghost story. But something in Terry's tone suggested this was different. "What kind of stories do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. Terry was quiet for a moment. Then with a heavy sigh, he started to speak. "This was about 20 years ago, when I was a rookie agent. I was paired up with this older officer, Garcia. Tough as nails he was, didn't say much. He'd been on the job for decades, I think, had seen it all. We were out on patrol one night, not far from here. It was a night just like this. Quiet, dark, not a soul around. We had been sitting for hours and I was starting to nod off, and that's when Garcia suddenly sat up straight, grabbing his goggles. "You see that?" he asked me, his voice all tense. I looked where he was pointing, but I didn't see anything. It was just empty desert. But Garcia insisted. He said he saw a figure, a man walking out there in the dark. He got out of the SUV, began to walk out into the desert. I called after him, but he ignored me and kept going. So I had no choice but to follow him. We walked together for maybe 10 minutes, but Garcia was always a few steps ahead of me. I kept asking him what he saw, but he just wouldn't answer. And then, all of a sudden, he stopped. Dead still, like he'd hit an invisible wall. I caught up to him, and that's when I saw it too. About 50 yards ahead of us, there was a man. At least I think it was a man. It was hard to tell. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked to be an old-fashioned suit, like something out of the 1800s. And he just stood there, in the middle of the desert, not moving. I began to call out to him, but Garcia grabbed me by the arm. His grip was like iron. "Don't," he said. And there was real fear in that voice. I'd never heard him sound like that before. Then the figure started to move. And I'm not saying he walked. He glided across the ground. And he was coming straight for us. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Every instinct in me was telling me to run. But I was frozen. The figure got closer and closer, and I could see its face now. Decrepit. Old. Older than any man should be. Garcia was the first to move, and when he finally unfroze, that thing was only a few feet away from us. He yanked me by the arm hard, pulling me back the way we came. We ran, stumbling through the dark, not looking back. We didn't stop until we made it back to the SUV. Garcia was shaken as he started the engine. I remember that part. We didn't speak the whole drive back to the station, but just before we got out of the SUV, Garcia turned to me. "You didn't see anything out here tonight," he said. It wasn't a question, it was an order. "We didn't see anything. Understand?" I nodded, too shaken to argue, and that was the last we ever spoke of it. Garcia retired a year later. Unrelated, I think, just health issues, but it did make me wonder. I tried to put it out of my mind, convincing myself it was a trick of the light, maybe even fatigue or tiredness, but I never quite could. Not fully. And over the years, I've heard other stories too. Other agents having similar experiences out here, always at night, always the same stretch of desert. They say it's a ghost, the spirit of some poor soul who died out here a long time back. Maybe a migrant, maybe a settler, who knows, but something keeps it here, making it wander these sands. And sometimes, just sometimes when the night is dark and the desert is quiet, it appears to the unlucky few who happen to cross it. Terry fell silent, his story finished. Jim and I sat there, not quite knowing what to say about it. The desert outside the vehicle suddenly seemed a lot darker, a lot more threatening. "Terry, are you just trying to freak us out? Did you really see something like that?" Jim asked. Terry just nodded. "As clear as I see you now, and I pray every night I never see it again." We didn't talk much after that. Each of us were lost in our own thoughts, just staring out into the night with a new sense of fear, thanks to Terry. I've been on countless patrols since that night, but every time I'm out there in this particular stretch of border, I can't help but think about Terry's story. I do find myself looking out into the dark a little more intently, my heart beating a little faster when I do see some shadows or hear an unexpected sound. I can't help but think about Terry's story. A part of me hopes I never will, but there is another part of me that wonders how true his story was and how many of the other agents have similar tales. Out here after dark in the desert, feels like anything could happen at any time. What happens along Canada? From Cooper Trooper. The life of a Border Patrol agent can be pretty lonely, especially when you're stationed along the US-Canadian border. The job requires you to be alert, patient, and okay with being alone for long whiles. But even for those of us who are used to the long stretches of quiet, there are moments that really shake us up, the kind of stuff that makes you question what's real and what's not. You can call me Alex, and as you could probably guess by now, I work as a Border Patrol agent. I'm stationed at a rather remote outpost in the dense forests of northern Minnesota, right next to the Canadian border. It's a beautiful location, with tall pines, clear lakes, and lots of wildlife. But it's also a place where the line between natural and supernatural apparently can get pretty blurry, and this story will tell you why I think that. Before this, I've always been skeptical about paranormal stuff. I've heard a story here and there from some of the other guys about strange lights in the sky or weird noises at night. Heck, I've even heard of Sasquatch sightings up here. But I always thought they were just people's imaginations running wild in the dark. Anyway, this happened October 13th of 2023. It was a crisp autumn evening. I was halfway through my usual 12-hour shift. That night was moonless, if I recall correctly. The stars were hidden by thick clouds anyway. I was driving along a lonely stretch of road, headlights cutting through the darkness as I looked for signs of activity along the tree line. To pass the time, I would occasionally chat with my friend Tom over the radio, who was hardly at work back at the station. He was about 20 miles east of me. We would often swap stories to keep each other awake during the long, boring hours.
Yo, Alex, did you hear about that strange light they spotted near Eli last week?
His voice crackled over the radio. I laughed. Hey Tom, let me guess. A UFO sighting.
Maybe, but no, this one was a bit different. From what I heard, it was a huge pulsing ball of light that just hovered over the trees for a few minutes before disappearing. They say some hikers got it on video, but I haven't seen it yet.
Sounds like a weather balloon to me, I said. There's my old skepticism kicking in.
Yeah, probably,
Tom agreed, but I don't think he sounded totally convinced. We were quiet for a while after that. Each of us focused on our own tasks. I kinda felt guilty, thinking maybe I was a buzzkill with my instant explanation to the supposed paranormal phenomenon. That night seemed to drag on forever. After Tom went quiet, I quickly became bored. I remember just thinking about plans for the next week when something happened. It started with a low, throbbing hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. At first, I thought it was my vehicle's engine acting up, but as the sound grew louder and more intense, I realized it was coming from somewhere else. I slowed to a stop, my heart racing as I scanned the trees for any movement. But the humming was getting louder now, and I didn't see any source. At that point, I could feel it vibrating in my bones, making my teeth chatter. And then, in an instant, the night exploded into blinding, searing light. It was like someone had flipped a switch, turning the dark night into a harsh, unforgiving whiteness that seemed to burn right through my eyes. I even threw my arm up to shield my face, squinting against the glare. My mind was racing, trying to explain what was happening. The light was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, a pulsing, throbbing brilliance. But it didn't seem to have a source. Let me just drill this home. It was the middle of the night and bright as the midday sun. Weirder yet, it didn't cast any shadows. The trees, the road, even the sky itself seemed to have been bleached of all their color, turned into a flat, featureless void. I then fumbled for the radio, my hands shaking as I tried to reach Tom. "Hey Tom, do you copy? Are you seeing this?" But my voice seemed small and far away, drowned out by the constant thrum of the light. I didn't get a response. There was only hissing static that seemed to get louder with each passing second. I felt a panic in my chest. I was then reminded I was completely alone, and the calm night had suddenly gone crazy. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. It just flicked right off. I was plunged instantly back into darkness. The sudden absence of the light left me temporarily blinded. I blinked rapidly, and eventually my eyes adjusted again. I sat there so confused. What in the world just happened? The humming was gone too, replaced by a very complete silence, which was almost deafening. Besides that, the night had returned to its natural state. The stars were visible again through the gaps in the clouds. But something was different. I could tell, and I don't think it was my remaining panic or paranoia. The air felt electric, as if that phenomenon had affected the very air around me. As I sat there, I tried to calm my racing heart, but I couldn't shake the feeling I had just witnessed something truly incredible, something that I still could not explain. Still shaking, I reached for the radio, and I tried Tom again. "Tom, are you there? Did you see that?" Still no response. More crackling static, and just my own heavy breathing. So I sat still for a while, trying to make sense of it and wondering what in the world I should do next. But then I began to hear something else. This was a deep, low rumble, like if the earth itself had become a sleeping beast. It was coming from the depths of the forest. It seemed to vibrate everything around me and everything in me. My teeth, my spine, my brain. For a moment, I hesitated. I wanted to kick it into gear and drive away, get away from that place. But also, I wanted to investigate. I was Border Patrol, and it was my job to confront any potential threats. no matter how strange or unexpected. But something about that sound filled me with a sense of dread. I was scared, and I couldn't quite explain it. Still, I knew I couldn't just sit there. I had to make a choice. One more time I reached for the radio, the shake in my voice increasing. "Dispatch, this is Alex. I'm hearing a strange noise coming from the woods, about a mile north of my current location. I'm gonna go check it out. Might need backup." Of course, no response. I then stepped out of my vehicle, my hand resting on my gun just in case. The night was very cold, very damp. The smell of pine and earth was very thick. I clicked on my flashlight. Step by step, I made my way into the forest, the rumbling sound growing louder and louder each passing moment. But I could tell it was coming from somewhere up ahead, deep within that tangled maze of trees and undergrowth that I could see. As I walked, I noticed something else, a pulsating light. Something in the distance was flickering, like a strobe. It was this sickly greenish-yellow color. The closer I got, the more intense it became, until it seemed to fill the entire forest with an eerie glow. And then a smell hit me. A sharp, acrid odor, like sulfur mixed with something else, something rotten and decaying. It filled my nose and mouth, making me gag and cough. I had to pull my shirt up over my nose, trying to block it out, but it seemed to seep into my pores, clinging to my skin. This morbid curiosity kept me going. The rumbling was deafening now, the light blinding. I was just about to break through the tree line, into what appeared to be a clearing where the light might be coming from, when it happened. There was a sudden, searing pain exploding in my head, like a white-hot knife being driven right into my skull. I remember clearly screaming at the top of my lungs and falling to my knees in agony. I kid you not, this was the worst pain I've ever felt. Like, imagine your brain being ripped apart from the inside. But then, I just remember waking up. I had apparently passed out. But when I came to, I was by my vehicle again. How I'd gotten there, unconsciously, I have no idea. My vision was a bit blurry as I tried to get up. The rumbling sound had stopped. There was no more pulsating light. Everything was silent, except for the distant hooting of an owl. My headache was completely gone, too. I looked around. When I first saw that I was next to my vehicle, my blood ran cold. I could hear from the ground outside. The radio was going crazy, a jumble of voices and static blaring from my speakers.
"Alex, do you copy? What's your status? Need backup at the northern perimeter. Strange lights reported in."
I staggered to my feet. How did I get here? I thought. What even happened in the woods? I then felt something warm and sticky on my upper lip. I reached up, and my fingers touched it. When I pulled them away, I saw that they were covered with blood. Blood that had poured from my nose all over my uniform. I fumbled for my phone, intending to call for help, but when I pulled it out of my pocket, I was even more confused and shocked. The screen was flashing. My phone was factory resetting itself. All my data, my contacts, my photos, everything had been gone. Who did that? How did that happen? Am I crazy? Have any of you ever had your phone just factory reset out of nowhere? I stood there just so freaked out. I didn't know what to do. In the end, I did the only thing I could do. I stumbled back into the vehicle, my hands trembling, and I took a deep breath. I tried to calm myself, and I pulled away, driving back to the nearest station, where I made a report of what I saw and got medical care. Luckily, X-rays and CT scans didn't find anything wrong with me. Tom believed my story, but I can't say the same about my other coworkers. I did take a day off, so that was nice. but it was hard to enjoy after experiencing something like that. So, in the end, what do you think it was? Some sort of weird UFO event? Maybe an asteroid or meteor with some sort of EMF that was strong enough to mess up my brain? And my phone? And what? Did it get up and carry me back to my vehicle? I don't know. I just don't know. Old Dogman Tales from West Goodland. Let me tell you some stories from back in my days with the CBSA, the Canada Border Services Agency. I personally spent most of my career either behind a desk, going through reports, or patrolling the forests along the border, keeping an eye out for drug mules and whatnot. It was a pretty quiet job most of the time, but every now and then, you would hear some stories that might make your skin crawl. This set of stories in particular regards a certain type of that my coworkers cited on multiple occasions. I remember one time sitting around the office with some of the other agents. We were shooting the breeze near the end of the day. One of the older guys, named Lewis, starts telling us about this weird thing he saw out in the woods. He said he'd been hearing stories about this creature for years, but he never really believed them. Not until he saw it himself. Here's how it went down according to him. Lewis was out on patrol in his vehicle one night, driving along a road that runs parallel to the border for several miles. It was pretty late, and he wasn't expecting to see anyone out there. But then, up ahead, he spots this van parked on the side of the road. He drives by it real slow, takes a look at it. He can see the tops of a couple of heads. Looks like a couple of folks either hiding or sleeping. Lewis wasn't sure if he wanted to investigate this. If it was just some people sleeping, it was a pretty common sight, especially for those who got lost on the road, mainly tourists and such. About 50 yards away from the van, he stops, pulls over, and decides he should check it out, just to be safe. He walks down to the van, enjoying the walk because he said the breeze felt nice. As he walks up to the driver's side window, he gets a better look at the inside. There is a couple in there, but they're not hiding. They both seem to be sleeping. Even so, he taps on the window. The guy inside wakes up startled. The man shifts around to get up, waking up the woman he's with. The guy rolls down the window, and Lewis asks, "Border Service, everything all right here?" The guy starts to explain they've been driving for hours, and they were just too tired to keep going. Apparently, they were from Michigan, on a little romantic road trip, but they were having trouble reading their map. They didn't know where the nearest gas station actually was, nor any motels. So they figured they would just pull over and catch a few winks. Now, Lewis is a pretty understanding guy. He tells them that's no problem, but they shouldn't be parking out here like this. He begins to explain some directions for them to the nearest town, when all of a sudden, he hears this loud snap behind him. The couple in the van look right past him, eyes wide and freaked out, so Lewis spins around to take a look. There on the other side of the road, he sees this thing standing there. At first, he thinks it's a bear or something, but then he realizes it's standing on two legs, and it's much leaner than a bear, and it's tall, like really tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet at least. The thing is just standing there perfectly still, like it's watching them. But Lewis can see it breathing. Lewis says at that point his heart was beating like it never had before. He was trying to figure out what the heck he was even looking at. He can see it was covered in fur, but it was not like any animal he'd ever seen. It had these yellow eyes, and Lewis swears the thing was just boring into his soul with the way it was staring. Lewis just stood there, and the couple kept staring. Nobody moved, nobody said a word. Then, as quickly as they saw it, the thing turns and bounds off into the forest. Lewis says at this part of the story, he had never seen a living creature move that fast in his life. It was like it was there 1 second and gone the next, in these huge strides. As you could probably guess, Lewis was really shaken up by then. The couple in the van could tell, and when Lewis turns around to face them again, the guy asks if he'd like a ride back to his vehicle before they head off. Now, it was only 50 yards or so, but Lewis was not too keen on walking back there alone after seeing that. So he takes them up on their offer, even though it's probably against some protocol, and he hops in the van. They drive him back to his vehicle. Lewis thanks them for the help, giving them a quick refresher about his directions, and they part ways. Lewis gets in his car and drives back to the office. When Lewis told us this story the first time, we were all pretty skeptical. I mean, a giant furry creature, walking on 2 legs. Sounds like a scary movie. But then a few of the other guys started to chime in, saying that they've heard similar stories over the years. That was the day that I realized this thing had been spotted all over the forests here, always at night too. Some folks called it a dogman, saying it was similar to the thing people claim to see in Michigan, in the US. Others say it's a wendigo. But really, nobody knew for sure what it was. All I knew was, after hearing Lewis's story, I started to pay more attention when I was out on patrol. I'd be lying to you if I said I didn't get a little jumpy every time I heard a twig snap or saw a shadow move in the trees. But that was part of my job, I guess. When you spend as much time in the woods as we did, you're bound to see some strange things out there, or at least hear them. And from the sounds of it, sounds like there's nothing quite as strange as coming face to face with a creature that's not meant to exist. That's just one of my stories from my time with the CBSA, one of the ones that stuck with me, probably because it was the first time I really began to believe that maybe there was something out there, something that we can't explain. Fast forward a few years from that, I was sitting in the break room with some of the newer recruits. We were swapping stories about the weird things we've seen out in the woods. One of the guys, not one of the new ones, Gene, starts telling us about this encounter he had only a few months ago. Gene was out on patrol one night. He gets a call about some underage kids who got caught trying to smuggle cases of booze across the border. He catches up to them, pulls them over, and sure enough, the car is full of beer and liquor, and they were years away from being legal. So he loads the kids into the back of his cruiser. He starts to head back to the station. He's giving them the usual lecture about how this is going to go on their permanent record and how they're lucky they didn't get caught by the American side, which is said to be much harsher. Then, all of a sudden, the kids start to scream bloody murder from the back seat. Gene, who had been glancing on and off at the rearview mirror as he talked, slammed on the brakes, startled. He looks up just in time to see this massive, hairy figure taking a step off the road and into the trees. He says it had to be about 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It was walking on 2 legs, like a person. For a second, Gene just sits there, wondering what in the world he just saw. He could hear the kids in the back, cursing, freaked out, and also excited, saying things like, "Dude, no way that was real." Gene couldn't agree with the kid, because he knew what he just saw, and he was beyond scared. Gene was just about to pull away when the back end of his cruiser suddenly dipped down. It was like something heavy just sat on the trunk. The kids start to scream again. Gene whips around to take a look at what's going on. There, pressed up against the back window, are these 2 glowing yellow eyes staring right at them. Gene says the thing had the snout of a dog, but it was far too big to be any kind of dog he'd ever seen. It had pointed ears like a wolf or something. But the really scary part was that it wasn't alone. As Gene's just sitting there, frozen in fear, he sees another set of eyes, just behind the first one. There were 2 of these things behind his car. Whatever they were both just looking at them, as if curious, or maybe wanting to get inside. He says he didn't know what to do. I don't think anyone knows what to do in that situation. He was armed, of course, but he wasn't about to start shooting at these things from the inside of the vehicle, not with the kids in the back. So he did the only thing he could think to do. He floored it. Says he must have went about 100 miles an hour, tearing down that dark, empty road, the idea of those things chasing after him in his head, though he doubts they actually were. The kids were screaming, not really sure if they were thrilled or terrified at his driving. He was really just praying that he could make it back to the station and not have to see anything else like that for the remainder of the night. Eventually, he sees the lights of the station up ahead. He pulls into the parking lot, tires squealing, and jumps out of the car, quickly getting those teenagers out and into the building. As he looked back right before going inside, he saw that the road was empty and the woods were quiet, as they should be. Gene says he didn't tell anyone what happened at first. He was way too creeped out and confused. A couple years later, he heard another story from a different agent, a similar one, and he decided to finally share his. It really helps you open up when you realize you may not be as crazy as you once thought. When Gene shared that story, the whole break room went quiet, but then more people began to open up. The more we talked, the more stories began to come out of the woodwork. Not every agent saw something like this, but they did have eerie things that they couldn't explain happen. For example, some of those guys claimed they'd seen things running alongside their cars, keeping pace at high speeds. Others said they'd found weird footprints in the snow, tracks that looked about 2 to 3 times bigger than a wolf's. Then there were the really wild stories, the ones that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Well, either that or made you laugh. Those were the ones I have trouble believing. Like the one from the agent who swore he saw these things rip a deer apart with their bare claws. Or the guy who claimed he'd been chased through the woods by a whole pack of them. Now, I definitely don't believe every one of these stories, especially the crazier ones like those. After all, there are some guys who just want to be a part of the crowd. But I'm not the end-all be-all of the truth. For all I know, all those stories were true in some way. This brings me to one more story that I've got for you. This one might be the creepiest of them all. It happened to a friend of mine, an agent who was working at one of those remote border stations, the kind that's miles away from anywhere and only staffed by a handful of people. It was late one night when my friend, Cheyenne, was working the graveyard shift with just one other lady. They were both sitting in the office just catching up on paperwork, trying to stay awake too, downing way too much coffee, as you do on those kinds of nights. That's when Cheyenne begins to hear these strange noises coming from outside. At first, she thinks it's the wind, maybe a raccoon or something. But as she listens closer, she realizes it sounds more like sniffing, like something is literally pressing its nose up against the walls of the building outside, taking deep breaths. She tries to ignore it and focus on her work, but the noises are getting louder and more persistent. After about 20 minutes of this, they stop altogether. She breathes a sigh of relief, then goes back to her paperwork, figuring whatever it was must have lost interest and wandered off. But then, about half an hour later, all hell breaks loose. Out of nowhere, this blood-curdling howl erupts from just outside the building. It was so loud somehow, so close, it makes the windows rattle. Cheyenne jumps out of her chair, covers her ears, and looks over at her coworker, who was white as a sheet. And then, before either of them could say a word, 2 more howls answered the first, coming from the opposite side of the office. It was like they were surrounded, like whatever was out there had them completely boxed in. Cheyenne's mind was racing, trying her best to figure out what in the world was making those sounds. She knew that there were wolves in the area, but this was something different. It sounded bigger, stronger than any wolf she had heard. And that's when things got really weird. She began to hear this scratching sound like claws on metal coming from the wall behind her desk. She turned around slowly, her eyes wide with fear. Because here's the thing. These clawing sounds were coming about 8 feet off the ground, way higher than any normal animal around these parts could reach. Sure, it could be a bear, but bears don't howl. For the next 20 minutes or so, Cheyenne and her coworkers sat there in terror, listening to the scratching, the sniffing, the howls, wondering what in God's name was out there with them and what they wanted. After what felt like forever, the noises began to fade away. She guessed whatever it was had finally given up and moved on. She and her coworkers sat there for a while, wordlessly. They were seriously too scared to move. She says it felt like if she moved or made too much noise, those things might come back. Think about that. Has anything scared you enough to instill prey-like thoughts in your head? When the next shift arrived, she went out to take a look. There were these deep claw marks gouged into the walls of the building on the outside. Marks that no coyote or wolf could have made. They were a bit too deep, too broad, too high up off the ground. The clincher, though. Cheyenne swears she could even smell the things that had been out there. There was this heavy, musky odor, a sort of stench she had never encountered around these parts before. And there you have it, the best 3 stories I've heard about the dog man cited by the CBSA. It's just so crazy that I feel like I'm just scratching the surface here about all the weird and unexplainable things that some of the agents have seen along the Canadian border. As for those dog man creatures, I wonder what they are. Mutated wolves? The missing link? Could be something even weirder, like some sort of furry alien. Truth is, I've got no idea. But after 30 years on the job, I've learned to keep an open mind. And at this point, I think I do believe that there's some sort of werewolf dogman type thing out there. Or at least something that looks like one. But hey, that's just one old agent's opinion. Take it for what it's worth. The Immigrant's Story. From Stuff Joseph Says. It was a scorching hot day out in the desert. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and dance like it's alive. I was doing my routes along the border when I run up on what appears to be an illegal immigrant with an injured leg. He's limping his way along and frowns when he sees me. He's in rough shape, his leg all twisted at a weird angle, his face pale with pain too. Looks like he had come a long way. I radio for help, and I carefully pull over and make my way out to him. The gravel there was pretty loose, and I try not to lose my footing. I ask him some questions. He was luckily bilingual, and admits he had crossed the border, stating that he's a Mexican citizen. I asked him where he thought he was going, and he said that he had some family out in New Mexico. He didn't have any papers, but I wasn't too worried about that just yet. Illegal or not, this guy needed some medical attention, and part of my job was to make sure he got it. I help him, half carrying, half dragging him back to my vehicle. It was slow going, but eventually we made it. I got him settled in the back seat and propped his torn up leg on a blanket. I started the long drive back to the nearest border patrol station. M was quiet at first, likely disappointed and scared. When you cross the border illegally and an agent finds you, guys like this are usually thinking when they're going to be sent back and whether or not they're going to make that long journey again, just to be sent back once more. Now, in all honesty, that's not the case for everyone. These days, many of these folks are just let in and given court dates, and as long as they show back up for court, they're often able to stay here for long periods of time until they get citizenship. After a while, he starts to relax a bit. The two of us get to talking. I ask him about his family in New Mexico. He says that's all the family he has left. His wife had just passed away, and he had nothing to his name. He had some kids, but they died in childhood, sadly. We keep driving for several more minutes. Eventually, the conversation turns to how the journey was, how tough it might have been, the things he saw out there. Then I see him smile, and he begins to open up with a story. I've heard my fair share of weird stories over the years, but what M tells me next sends a chill down my spine and a smile across my face. It was both eerie and a bit wholesome. M said that a few nights back, he was trying to sleep out in the open, covered only by a tarp he'd brought with him. That's when a man suddenly appeared out of nowhere. The guy came right up and just sat down on a nearby rock. He was a gringo, M says, wearing old worn-out clothes with a big bushy beard. At first, the man just sat there, sipping at a dark brown bottle, which M assumed was alcohol. He sat up, eyeing the man warily, wondering what he wanted and how he had managed to sneak up on him like that. The gringo spoke. He asked him where he was going. His voice was low and gravelly. M hesitated for a moment, not sure if he should answer at all. But something about the man's calm, steady gaze made him feel like he could trust him. "To my family," M said, "in New Mexico." The man smiled at him, then took another swig from his bottle. He cleared his throat, and when he started to speak again, he went straight away giving M directions. And M says the man's voice took on a strange, almost hypnotic quality. He told the immigrant exactly where to go, which paths to take, which ones to avoid. Then, almost as an afterthought, he warned M about the pit, a deep and treacherous drop-off in the ground that he needed to steer clear of at all costs. M listened carefully, committing the man's words to memory. And just as suddenly as he'd appeared, the man stood up, walked off into the distance, and as his figure grew smaller and smaller, M blinked and he vanished. M really focused on this part, describing that the man didn't just fade away in the distance. Rather, his figure was gone in the blink of an eye, and yet there was nothing nearby the man for him to hide behind to disappear like that. There was just no sign of him anymore. This weirded him out, but he went back to sleep, needing the energy for the rest of the journey. Come morning, he packed up his tarp and his water and set out again, following the directions the man had given him, because otherwise he really had nothing to go on. Then the strangeness of the night turned into a miracle, because the path the man gave him led him straight to a gap in the border fence, a narrow opening that he never would have found on his own. M squeezed through, more excited than ever. He started to make his way across the desert on the other side. But then, just as he was starting to think he might actually make it, he hit a patch of loose gravel and lost his footing. He tumbled down into a ditch, his leg twisting underneath him with a sickening crunch. M explains he was actually lucky. It could have been much worse. I glanced back at him and asked how. Well, supposedly, just a few feet away from where he'd fallen, there was a steep, jagged drop-off, so deep and sudden, he never would have seen it coming. If he had taken just a few more steps over, he would have gone tumbling over that edge, and that would have been the end of him. As I listened to his story, I got goosebumps. I'd heard plenty of strange stories over the years, yeah, but this was different. It was like the man had known what was going to happen, like he'd been looking out for M somehow. Makes me wonder, who was that guy? Just some random gringo, out wandering the desert for kicks? Or was he something more than that? I emptied my thoughts and just focused on driving back to the station. M got the medical attention he needed. And as far as I know after that, M actually made it to his family in New Mexico, and he's well on his way to citizenship. All of this just goes to show you, The desert is one weird place.